author of Once We Were Slaves, and I wanted to explain something about how to search for ancestors who may have been enslaved on the island of Barbados during the 19th century using some of the different databases that are available on Ancestry. And what I'm really going to get at is how to understand the information that you're seeing once you find a record, as well as how to actually track down some of the records, because it's a little bit counterintuitive. So the person we're looking for, again, is this gentleman named James Brandon Jr., who we know was born in 1832 and died in 1910. He was born in Barbados and died in Australia in New South Wales. We know from his records in Australia that his father's name was also James Brandon, and his mother's maiden name was Mercy, and something that sounds like Pollock. So we think that he's related to this gentleman, Isaac Lopez Brandon. In fact, you can sort of see this isn't the greatest evidence, but there does seem to be some resemblance between the two. So either to him or to his father. So fortunately, the names of James Brandon was actually quite familiar to me as somebody who worked on the family of the Brandons and wrote a book about them. So I'm going to have some tricks for how I was actually able to find those records, since I actually knew that they were there. So the first thing that we want to do is go ahead and go to those former British Colony Dependency slave registers, which are from 1813 to 1834. And as the Ancestry site explains, as the abolition of the Slave Trade Act came into force in 1807, they wanted to clamp down on people being brought in illegally into the British West Indies. And so they started to make sure, starting in 1819, that enslaved people were being registered. And we actually see it starting a little bit earlier in some of the colonies, including Barbados in 1817, and it was done every 3 years. And this register captures some of the people, but not all of the people, and for reasons that I'm going to get at that kind of complicate our search a little bit. And basically what it's doing is capturing at particular moments, and we can see for Barbados, 1817, 1820, 1823, 1826, every 3 years up until 1834, which is when general emancipation happened, though many of those people who were emancipated in 1834 still had to wait another 4 years where they were kept as what was called apprentices, which was really another form of slavery on the island until they were truly emancipated in 1838. So this means any particular one of these registers is going to tell us who is in that particular person's custody at that particular year, as well as who they had sold since the last register and who had come into their possession since the last register. It doesn't, however, indicate who is emancipated or manumitted, and that means people who were legally freed. And we're going to see that complicates things a little bit for us in our search, because I'm going to suggest that one of the people that we're looking for happens to have been emancipated. So if we do a search, one of the things that you'll notice, let's say we wanted to look for James and then Brandon. We think his birth year is 1832 and lived in Barbados. It's really helpful to put in the island because otherwise you're going to get stuff from a bunch of other islands. But one thing that we're going to notice when we search for this is that it's going to be really frustrating because it shows nobody. And that's because the names that are coming up typically are the people who enslaved people, not the people who were enslaved. So this is where it really helped that I knew who some possible people that were enslaved. So the person that I suspected was the person who actually owned James Brandon Jr. at the time of 1832 when he was born, was this gentleman, Isaac Lopez Brandon, who had also been born enslaved. And so let's go ahead and search for Isaac, and we're going to get rid of that birth year. Yeah, that's who we want. And so we're going to search for him, and we're going to see, okay, in 1834, here's the record. And notice it gives us already this information. There's 2 people living in his household. And I'm going to actually click on the original record because I want to explain what's going on here, because again, I think it's a little counterintuitive. So this is the returns of a variety of people. You can see the first one is John Beckles, and then here's the one that we want, which is Isaac Lopez Brandon. So we're going to scroll in and then go down, and I'm going to explain what each of these categories means. So it's the return. That means the people who are registered to Isaac Lopez Brandon, slaves on his own property, meaning people that he owned. And then we learn that it's one person, Mary Ann, who was 21 years old. She was a category which referred to as colored at the time, which means that she is of mixed African and white ancestry, and she's Barbadian. That means she was born in Barbados. And then we also know there's another person. This is the female category. This is the male category. A young person named James, who is 1 year and 9 and 12 months, which will help us actually pin down his birthday, which should then, since this register was done on the 31st of March in 1834, should make his birthday, according to this, the January of 1832. He is also somebody who is mixed race and born in Barbados, but again, he's less than 2 years old. So this date of March of 1834 is the date when the return was recorded by the government. It's not his birth date, but rather the date that things are recorded. This one means in the household total, there is one male and one female who were enslaved to Isaac Lopez Brandon. And then I'm going to further zoom in over here, and this is where it gets a little bit irritating that people's handwriting may not be the greatest. And it says purchased at Marshall's sale of, and this is an abbreviation for Thomas Pollard. So Thomas Pollard, deceased. So, and it's telling us that this first person, Mary Ann, was purchased at that Marshall sale of somebody who had died named Thomas Pollard. And then the second person was not purchased at that sale. He was somebody who was born when his mother had already been purchased by Isaac Lopez Brandon. So that tells us that she must have been purchased sometime before James was born, so in 1831 or 1832. So that's helpful to us in terms of narrowing down when they both came into the possession of Isaac Lopez Brandon. And we know that it's probably right before he was born, because we didn't see a slave register including her for 1832 for Isaac Lopez Brandon. So that's what all that information means. How would I know that this is Thomas? Because that seems cryptic at best. I have a website called the Indian Converts Collection. It has a study guide on early American handwriting, including abbreviations, an early American handwriting game. If you're having problems reading it, it can teach you how to read their handwriting, and also something that teaches you the various abbreviations for names. And again, here's our one for Thomas down here. So again, unfortunately, this requires a little bit of specialized knowledge in order to figure out what is being said there. Okay, so now I know something about them, and my next step probably would be to go ahead and go back to that return to the slave registrar, and let's search then for that Thomas Pollard instead of searching for Isaac Lopez Brandon. And again, notice he doesn't have one from 1832, so that's again narrowing down our date that she must have been purchased before that was taken. So we'll keep going back, and we're going to search this time for Thomas Pollard. And I'm really interested probably in that 1832 one. So here's one that's for 1834. 1832 would give me some information. This one's going to tell us who was sold in between the time when the 1832 census happened. I'm calling them censuses, but they're slave registers. Census for enslaved people, basically. And when in 1834, when the next census was taken. So let's go ahead and take that in. Notice we're seeing her name is actually not Mary Ann, but Mercy Ann. So maybe she's going by both names, Mercy Ann Pollard or Mary Ann Pollard. Those are really close and could be something that was misheard by the person or just mistranscribed. So not really surprising. Notice that she's exactly the right age. She's 21 in both. And we don't have, if we were to look up all the Pollards, we would see she is our person, besides that he's the only Thomas Pollard on the island. Okay, so again, we've got this register. Here we are down here, and we're seeing this is the return of Judith Pollard of slaves of the property of Thomas Pollard, deceased. So again, that tells us he died sometime sometime around or slightly before the 1834 census, and I'll show you how to find out when he died. Here are the 4 people that were in the possession of the family, but then notice that this first person is recorded again, Mercy Ann, a multiracial woman who was born in Barbados, who's 21. Again, this is very, and this is one decrease, one person down, or bringing it down to 3 people total, was sold at a Marshall's sale to Isaac Lopez Brandon. And again, it helps to have read these handwritings a lot of times. So we see, again, her name is Mercy Ann Mary Ann Pollard, and so that helps us correct the last name that we thought was Pollock, which could have been a Jewish last name, and it turns out no, it's actually a Christian last name, Pollard. Again, it could have been cross-referenced. I actually looked it up in a book of gravestones for the Jewish community of Barbados to see if there was somebody with the last name Pollock, who sometimes might have gone by Pollard, or they would have heard it as Pollard, who is a Hazan, which is from Suriname, Ephraim Pollock. And no, this is somebody different. So again, there's no Thomas Pollard who ends up dying. And we're going to see when we check the Barbados church records, we're going to find him that he was buried in the Anglican cemetery. So this part of the family, this slaveholding family, is a Christian family. Okay, so let me show you then really quickly. Here's the church records. Again, here he is, Thomas Pollard. He was buried at, it says St. George, Barbados. That turns out not to be correct. On the 23rd of April, 1832. If we go and look, we see here he is. It actually, he says St. George because that must have been where he normally lived, but he was actually buried at St. Michael's, so in Bridgetown. St. Michael's is the parish in Bridgetown. On the 23rd of April, he was 42 years old. This is the person who performed the burial ceremony. Notice it's somebody different from who normally does it if you're, say, in St. Thomas. We could go back to those church records database and we could search for other people. And in fact, let's search for that Judith Pollard, who most likely was his wife, but let's just check and see if that is the case. Usually the wife would be the person, and we see, here we have a record of her being buried in 1834. This might not actually be the correct wife because this might be somebody who was owned by the family previously. My reason for suspecting that is that actually this Judith Pollard says that she's a FM, which means she's a free woman of color. And her age is a lot older than the man that died. So that seems like more likely that she is somebody who had belonged to the family who passed away. So let's go back and see if we can find out something else, a different Judith who might have been married to him. So let's go back and search for that Thomas Pollard. Again, this is going to seem like a wild goose chase. In the Barbados church records, it's searching. Thomas Pollard, and here we go. Here's his burial. But we also see here's a marriage to a woman named Judith in 1814. And so we do know that there is a different Judith, not Judith A, but a different Judith who was his wife. These are kept by baptism, marriages, burials. This is the one for St. Michael's, which again is the parish where Bridgetown is. Here's Thomas Pollard to Judith Harris. And notably, notice they're not marked. They would have marked the race. If there's no race marked during this time period, it means in 1814, it means that they're white. Notice that here it says this person is a free person of color. These people are white. So that other Judith wasn't her, but here we do see that he was married to a woman named Judith. So that person who owned Mercy Ann, but when she was pregnant, before she was sold to Isaac Lopez Brandon, was indeed the widow of Thomas Pollard. Okay, so that gives us that information. Let's dig a little bit deeper into, there's a question of like, okay, so I had actually sort of assumed before I was contacted that maybe Isaac Lopez Brandon was the father of that young child, just because it seemed odd that he had bought somebody so close to when people were being manumitted. And in addition, it was sort of out of character for him. His fathering had a lot of people that were enslaved to him, but Isaac himself had begun his life in slavery, and this was the only example of him having owned anybody who was enslaved. So it was actually interesting that James Brandon Jr.'s own records listed James Brandon as being the father as opposed to Isaac Lopez Brandon. So that was really curious to me, and suggested that maybe there was a different familial relationship. So the question that was brought up was this person maybe instead the son of somebody who is the natural son of Isaac's father, Abraham Rodriguez Brandon? And to look at that, we want to go back to those slave registers and to look to see who was of the right age that could have been enslaved to Abraham Rodriguez Brandon, who would be a free person, who would be a person of color. We had a second piece of information, which is the will of Abraham Rodriguez Brandon manumits two people, one of which is somebody that he refers to as colored boy, so somebody who's multiracial, and he uses this term boy, and my boy is really ambiguous for these kinds of records. It could mean somebody who is enslaved to me who was a child. It could mean somebody who is enslaved to me who I just think of as young. It could mean my own child, who I'm calling boy because I don't want to recognize him completely as being my child, but the fact that he's only manumitting two people out of the over 300 people that are enslaved to him at his death suggests some sort of personal relationship. So if we go back to looking at those different colonial dependencies, here's Abraham Rodriguez Brandon. I went back to 1817, hoping that I could capture somebody who would be about the right age to be this James Senior that we're looking for. That would be that person of color that was manumitted. Abraham Rodriguez dies in 1831, so we're not going to probably capture him in the 1832 census, and indeed he's not on there. So then we have the tedious job of going through and looking for all the different possible people who might be named James, going down, 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 onto the next page. We're still looking for a James, nope. We're still looking for a James, no. Next page. Again, he has an enormous number of people who are enslaved to him. And finally, when we get to this last page, we find a couple of people named James. There's this man, James, who is male. He is Black. That means that he is mainly of African descent, so is unlikely to be that person that was racialized by Abraham Rodriguez Brandon as his, quote, colored boy, because again, it's the wrong racial designation. He's a Mason, he's 32, so he would have been a great bet. He's a little bit old for somebody like Mercy, but he has a nice occupation, but again, racialized incorrectly. But here's this younger person, James, who's male, who is of the right racial designation. He is a child in 1817. He's 9 years old. Again, he's born in Barbados, which would make sense if Abraham Rodriguez Brandon is his possible father. And that would put his birth at 1808 if we're just subtracting from 1817 and we subtract the 9, or approximately 1808. So here we're now having a possible suspect for who that father of James Jr. might be. This young man named James, who would have still been of an age where his father might, if Abraham Rodriguez Brandon is the father, might have referred to him as a boy when he was manumitted. So that would suggest that then this person who was purchased sort of inadvertently or advertently when his mother was pregnant by Isaac Lopez Brandon is actually Isaac's nephew, or half-brother's son. And this seems really interesting to me because we know when Isaac's father died that he actually was put in charge of Abraham Rodriguez Brandon's estate as an executor, but also became the person who oversaw the education of his father's younger children by a different mother than Isaac had had, and he was supposed to be taking care of them and raising them as Jews. But here we see possibly he's also working on behalf of somebody who might have been his half-brother who had been born enslaved like Isaac was, and is working to make sure that that young child who's about to be born in early 1832 is somebody who's not going to have to spend all of his early years working either as somebody enslaved or as one of these apprentices. And the woman who seems to have been involved with James Brandon Sr. Also would have had presumably a better outcome. And this is pretty common on the island of Barbados, that we see free people of color purchasing relatives in order to safeguard them. So a really different process than somebody like Isaac's father who's purchasing people for profit. Isaac here most likely would have been purchasing this person to keep them out of harm and to keep them from being abused by other people. So in order to confirm that this man, James Brandon, or James Brandon's senior, his father, that person who we think we've identified on that register from 1817, would be the child and grandson of Abraham Rodriguez Brandon, and hence this person, the nephew, Isaac Lopez Brandon, you'd really probably need to go back and follow that up with some DNA tests and see if there's matches between people who are known descendants of Isaac Lopez Brandon or his sister, Sarah Rodriguez Brandon. And fortunately, some of the descendants of that pair have done DNA tests, and you could see if you have common ancestors. I just wanted to give one final tip if you're still hanging in there. Let's go back and do that Mercy Pollard, because it turns out we're going to see, and so remember, she was born about 1813. She's born in Barbados. And let's go ahead and search for her, because it turns out we can find out a lot more about her as well, including that she married a gentleman named William in 1840. So she may have had this relationship with James Sr. There's no record that I could find. I couldn't find James Sr. in the Barbados church records, but she's, at least by 1840, marrying somebody else in St. Michael's. So again, in that parish around Bridgetown. But we also see there's actually some other information about her in terms of people who are descendants. And if we would actually search, not for her, let's go for Pollard. And let's get rid of this year. And let's go for mother is Mercy Pollard. Let's look and see, because I believe we're going to actually find some other various people. So here's Mercy, and we can see here's another child that's born slightly after the birth of James. So we're seeing a sister of him. And again, you could go through these various records and figure out which of these people are actually Mercy's children. Thank you so much. So I hope that helps you understand some of that evidence, where it's coming from, what do the different things mean, how can you interpret what's going on the slave registers, as well as what can you possibly do with what's going on those church records.